The knock on my door came at 7:15 on a Saturday morning, which is the kind of hour that tells you immediately the person on the other side doesn't respect you. I opened it in my bathrobe, coffee in hand, and found a man I'd never spoken to standing on my porch wearing khaki pants and a polo shirt with a small embroidered logo I didn't recognize. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, thick through the shoulders, with the particular bearing of a man who'd spent decades being the biggest personality in whatever room he was standing in. He was holding a clipboard, and he was looking past me into my house before I'd even said a word. "Mr. Decker," he said. Not a question. A statement, like he was reading my name off a list. "That's me," I said. "I'm Warren Pruitt. I'm the president of the Ashford Glen Homeowners Association." He paused on that title, the way some men pause after they say they're a doctor or a judge, like the words themselves were supposed to shift the air between us. "I've completed a walkthrough of your property this morning, and I need to discuss several items with you." I looked past him. My driveway, my lawn, my side yard, all of it exactly as I'd left it the night before. "You walked my property," I said, "this morning, before you knocked." "Compliance inspections don't require homeowner presence," he said, and flipped a page on his clipboard. "I'm noting 4 separate violations. Your side yard storage unit is non-compliant, in both size and placement. Your basketball hoop is in violation of our driveway equipment policy. Your window boxes contain plants not on the approved species list, and your front door color doesn't match the approved exterior palette." He tore a yellow sheet off the clipboard and held it out to me. I took it. I looked at it. 4 violation citations, each with a fine amount, each with a compliance deadline. The total, if I didn't cure every violation within 30 days, was $480, and each item that remained uncured after 30 days would accrue an additional $50 per week. I looked up at Warren Pruitt. He met my eyes with the calm certainty of a man who had never once been told no. "Have a good morning," he said, and turned and walked back down my driveway. I stood in my doorway holding that yellow sheet and watching him go. And I thought, I have never in my life wanted to understand something as badly as I want to understand exactly who this man thinks he is. What I found out over the next 14 months answered that question in ways I never could have anticipated. And by the end of it, Warren Pruitt had his answer too. My name is Joel Decker. I'm 52 years old, and I've spent the last 23 years as a high school history teacher in Columbus, Ohio. My wife Sandra teaches 4th grade at the elementary school, 2 miles from our house. We have 2 kids. Our daughter, Mia, is 24 and lives in Chicago, and our son Ben is a junior at Ohio State. We are not wealthy people by any stretch of the imagination, but we are comfortable, and the house we bought in Ashford Glen 9 years ago is the first and only house we've ever owned, bought with the down payment we'd been saving since our wedding. Ashford Glen is a mid-sized subdivision in a suburb, about 15 miles outside Columbus. 240 homes, built in phases between 2003 and 2009. The kind of neighborhood where the houses are close enough together that you learn your neighbor's habits, whether you intend to or not. We'd chosen it because the schools were good, the commute was manageable, and the neighborhood felt lived in and real. Kids playing outside, people working in their yards, block parties in the summers. The HOA had been more or less invisible during our first 7 years there. We paid our dues, attended maybe 2 annual meetings, and otherwise never heard from anyone. Then Warren Pruitt ran for HOA board president. He'd moved into Ashford Glen about 5 years before my Saturday morning visitor, into one of the larger corner lot homes, near the front of the neighborhood. I knew him the way you know a neighbor you've never had reason to talk to by sight, by the car in his driveway, by the perfectly maintained state of his lawn. He was retired, I'd heard, from some kind of regional sales management position. He had time on his hands and opinions about how things should be done. And eventually, he decided the HOA was the right vehicle for both. He ran on a platform of, and I am not making this up, restoring Ashford Glen to its full potential. His campaign, which consisted of flyers and mailboxes and a neighborhood Facebook group, Blitz emphasized property values, curb appeal, and what he called letting the standard slip for too long. He won the presidency with about 60% of the votes that were cast, which sounds decisive until you realize that only about 30% of homeowners bothered to vote at all. Warren Pruitt became president of the Ashford Glen HOA with a mandate from fewer than 1 in 5 homeowners, and he proceeded to govern as though he'd been elected by God personally. I want to be fair and tell you that during the first 2 weeks after that Saturday morning knock, I genuinely tried to handle things the right way. I read the violation notice carefully. I pulled up the Ashford Glen secanders on the HOA website, a PDF that hadn't been updated since 2011, based on the footer and cross-referenced each cited violation against the actual text. The storage unit issue. The secanders specified that accessory structures over 120 square feet required board approval. My shed was 96 square feet. I measured it twice. The basketball hoop. The policy stated that portable basketball equipment could not be stored in the driveway, permanently, or for extended periods. Our hoop was on wheels. We moved it to the garage in winter. That seemed like the opposite of permanent. The window boxes. The secandars listed approved annual and perennial plant species in an appendix. The appendix referenced a document called the Ashford Glen Landscaping Guidelines. That document was not on the website. I submitted a written request for it through the HOA contact form. The front door color. The secandars referenced an approved exterior color palette document, also not on the website. I requested that one too. I emailed the HOA management contact a company called Premier Community Management, explaining that I was having trouble finding the reference documents and asking for copies before the compliance deadline. I also noted the shed measurement discrepancy and asked for the specific provision that applied to it. I got an auto reply acknowledging my message. That was it, for 9 days. On day 10, I got a response from a woman at Premier named Gail, who said the landscaping guidelines and color palette were available for review at the HOA office during business hours. The HOA office was Warren Pruitt's house. Those were his business hours. I thought that was the strangest thing I'd encountered so far in this situation. I had no idea how quickly I would be proven wrong. Sandra and I talked it over that weekend. We were both conflict averse, by nature you kind of have to be, to spend your career in a school building, and our instinct was to find the path of least resistance. Maybe repaint the door. Maybe swap out a few plants. Not worth the aggravation. But the shed measurement bothered me. I'd built that shed myself, over 2 weekends 3 summers ago, specifically looking up the size restrictions beforehand, to stay compliant. If the citation was factually wrong, capitulating to it felt like agreeing to something false. I drove to Warren Pruitt's house on a Tuesday evening, knocked on his door, and asked to see the landscaping guidelines and the color palette. He invited me in with the warmth of a man who enjoys having people come to him, and he showed me a binder, an actual 3-ring binder. Clearly his personal copy of what he called the Ashford Glen Standards Manual. It contained both documents, plus several others I hadn't seen referenced anywhere. The color palette listed 42 approved front door colors. My door, a deep teal, was not among them. I had painted it myself 2 years earlier, and genuinely hadn't known approval was required. I was willing to concede that one. The landscaping guidelines listed approved plants. My window boxes had trailing petunias and sweet potato vine. Neither was on the list. Fine. But then I asked him about the shed. I told him I'd measured it at 96 square feet, and that the C&Ds specified that structures over 120 square feet needed approval. He looked at me with what I can only describe as tolerant patience, the way a teacher looks at a student who's missed the obvious point, and said the shed's placement within 10 feet of the property line was the actual violation, not the size. He pointed to a sentence in the standards manual about setback requirements for accessory structures. I asked to see the original secandars provision that setback was derived from. He turned to a different page in the binder. I looked at it for a long moment. The setback requirement existed. I had missed it when I read the scanders. That one was legitimately on me. So, he said, folding his hands on his kitchen table. 4 violations. I'd suggest prioritizing the shed relocation. That's going to take the most time. The door and the plants should be straightforward. The basketball hoop. I'll need to see it repositioned off the driveway surface, when not in active use. He said, all of this with the calm authority of someone describing a project plan. Not unkind, exactly. Just completely certain that what he was saying was the only possible way forward. I drove home and told Sandra. She listened, and then she said, "What's the basketball hoop rule actually based on? Is it in the secanders or just in that binder of his?" I stopped. I thought about it, and I realized I didn't know. That question turned out to matter a great deal. I spent the following weekend doing something I should have done from the start, reading the entire Siender's document, all 38 pages of it, carefully, not skimming, reading. And then, I went through the standards manual Warren had shown me I'd taken notes on my phone while I was at his house, and I started matching each provision in the manual against a corresponding provision in the actual secondars. Some of them matched. The shed setback was in the secondars. The exterior color approval requirement was in the secondars. The restriction on commercial vehicles was in the secondars. But the basketball hoop policy wasn't. Not in the secondars, not in the HOA bylaws, which I'd also downloaded. What the Sienders said, in the section on personal property, was that homeowners could not store vehicles, equipment, or materials in front yard areas in a manner that creates an unsightly appearance for a sustained period. That was it. No mention of basketball hoops. No mention of driveway equipment. No specific prohibition. The standards manual's basketball hoop language was more specific and more restrictive than anything authorized by the Sienders. Warren Pruitt had written additional rules, put them in a binder, and was enforcing them as though they were legally binding without board approval, without homeowner vote, without any of the amendment procedures required by the Sienders themselves. I thought that was interesting. I thought it in the specific, careful way I try to get students to think about primary sources, not just what it says, but what it means. I also started looking at the Ashford Glen HOA Facebook group, which I'd mostly ignored for years. I started reading backward through the posts, going month by month. What I found was a slow building pattern of violation notices, compliance disputes, and homeowners expressing confusion about rules they couldn't find in the actual governing documents. Most of them had eventually backed down. A few had left the neighborhood entirely, citing the HOA as part of their reason. One post from about 18 months prior, since deleted, but someone had screenshotted and reposted, showed a homeowner asking pointedly where the authority for a specific rule came from, and getting a response from Warren that said, essentially, that the board had discretion to interpret and apply community standards as it saw fit. I thought about that phrase for a long time. Discretion to interpret and apply. It's the kind of language that sounds reasonable until you realize it's doing a lot of work. I fixed the door color, Sandra. Picked a very nice deep navy from the approved list, and I swapped out the window box plants. Those were easy enough. But I didn't move the shed, and I didn't move the basketball hoop, and I sent Warren a formal letter, explaining why. For the shed, I wrote that I'd reviewed the Sienders and found the setback provision, but that the shed's position was a result of my reading the document and concluding compliance before construction, and that I was requesting a variance under the Sienders variance procedure, which did exist, buried in Section 19, and required a board vote at a regular meeting. For the basketball hoop, I wrote that I had reviewed the Sienders and bylaws in full, and had not been able to locate the provision under which the hoop was cited. I asked Warren to provide the specific Siender section number, or bylaw reference, that authorized the basketball hoop restriction in the standards manual. I sent the letter certified mail. I emailed a copy to Premier Community Management. Warren's response came 8 days later. The variance request was denied, not voted on at a board meeting. Just denied, with a note that said, "The board has reviewed and finds no basis for variance." The basketball hoop question was answered with a single line. The standards manual has been adopted by the board and constitutes an extension of the community's governing documents. No, Citation. No bylaw reference. No vote record. I was still thinking about that response, still running it through the part of my brain that grades essays and looks for unsupported claims when Sandra got home from school and found a second violation notice tucked under the windshield wiper of her car in the driveway. New violation. A crack in the driveway apron that Warren had determined was a maintenance failure creating an aesthetic nonconformity. Our driveway apron. The place where the driveway meets the street. A crack that had been there since before we moved in. The fine was $75, with a 60-day cure period. Sandra looked at me across the kitchen counter and said, very quietly, "Joel, he's escalating." She was right, and I thought it was time I started doing the same. I want to tell you about a man named Phil Garrett, because Phil changed the course of everything that followed. Phil was a retired contractor who'd lived in Ashford Glen since the subdivision was built. He was 69 years old, drove a 10-year-old pickup, and had a reputation in the neighborhood for knowing where everything was buried, literally and figuratively. He'd served on the original HOA board back when the development was new, before term limits had pushed him out. We'd talked at block parties. I liked him. I knocked on his door on a Friday evening and asked if I could talk to him about the HOA. He waved me inside without a word, like he'd been expecting this conversation. I laid out the whole situation, the violations, the standards manual, the basketball hoop authority question, the variance denial that had never gone to a board vote. Phil listened without interrupting, which is the mark of someone who already knows most of what you're telling them. When I finished, he said, "How much do you know about how the current board was set up?" I said, "Not much." He got up and went to a filing cabinet in his spare bedroom and came back with a folder. He set it on the coffee table, between us. "Warren Pruitt rewrote the board structure 2 years ago," Phil said. "Pushed through a bylaw amendment that changed the board from 7 members to 5. Said it would make the board more efficient. What it actually did was eliminate 2 seats that were held by people who pushed back on him." I looked at the amendment document in the folder. It had passed at an annual meeting with 22 votes in favor. The total homeowner count in Ashford Glen was 240. 22 votes, less than 10%. Is that legal? I asked. Depends on what the original bylaws required for amendment, Phil said. I always thought it needed a majority of the full membership. Warren's position was that it only needed a majority of votes cast at a meeting with a quorum. I asked what the quorum requirement was. Phil smiled for the first time. 15 homeowners present. 22 votes at a meeting that required 15 for quorum. Warren Pruitt had restructured the entire governance of a 240-home HOA with 22 votes, using an interpretation of the amendment threshold that may or may not have been correct, but that had never been challenged. "Phil," I said slowly, "has anyone ever looked at whether that amendment was validly passed?" "No," he said, "but I always thought someone should." I drove home with photocopies of everything in that folder. I wasn't a lawyer, but I was a history teacher, and what I understood about primary sources and institutional authority was about to become the most useful skill I'd ever developed outside a classroom. I called an attorney. Her name was Margaret Hollis, and she practiced in Columbus with a focus on real estate and community association law. A friend of a colleague had used her for a property dispute and spoken highly of her directness. I laid out the full situation in a 40-minute phone call, including the bylaw amendment issue Phil had flagged. Margaret said, and I remember this clearly because it was the first moment I felt something shift, "The amendment question is the most significant thing you've told me. If the original bylaws required a majority of the total membership, not just votes cast for amendment, and that wasn't achieved, the bylaw change eliminating those 2 seats is invalid. Which means the board has been operating with an improperly constituted structure for 2 years. Which means every board decision made during that period is potentially challengeable. Every board decision. Every fine. Every enforcement action. Every denial of every variance request. All of it, potentially, built on a foundation that didn't hold. I told Margaret about the standards manual and the basketball hoop, rule with no secondary basis. She said that unauthorized rules enforced as though they were binding governing documents was a separate issue. Equally serious, that could amount to improper assessment of fines, which under Ohio's planned community law carried homeowner remedies, including fee shifting. I asked her what we should do. She said, "First, I need to see the original bylaws, the actual recorded document, not what's on the website. We get that from the county recorder's office." The county recorder's office, where documents are filed and cannot be edited and do not disappear. I requested the original Ashford Glen Declaration, bylaws, and all recorded amendments the following Monday morning. They arrived as certified copies within a week. The original bylaws required an affirmative vote of a majority of the total membership, meaning more than 50% of all 240 homeowners, to amend the bylaws. Not a majority of votes cast at a quorum meeting. A majority of total membership. 121 votes, minimum. Warren Pruitt's restructuring amendment had received 22. I thought about that number for a long time, and then I thought about what Phil Garrett had said. No one had ever challenged it. Until now. What happened next was a convergence, several things coming together at once. The way they sometimes do when a situation has been building for long enough. Margaret filed a formal challenge to the bylaw amendment with the Ashford Glen HOA board, citing the original bylaws amendment threshold and arguing that the 22 restructuring was void ab initio. Legally speaking, it had never been valid. She demanded that the board acknowledge the invalidity, restore the original 7-member structure, and hold new elections for the 2 eliminated seats within 60 days. At the same time, I'd been quietly connecting with other homeowners who'd received violations. Over about 3 weeks of neighborhood conversations, I found 11 families who had paid fines under rules they couldn't find in the actual standards. I found 4 people who'd paid fines under the standards manual's basketball hoop provision specifically. I found 2 families who had been denied variances in the same summary manner. I had no board vote, just a note from Warren. And I found 3 families who had sold their homes and moved away, at least in part because of HOA disputes, and who were willing to speak about it. Phil Garrett signed an affidavit describing what he knew about the bylaw amendment meeting, including his observation that the room had contained approximately 20 to 25 people, and that there had been no discussion of whether the threshold for a full membership majority had been met. Margaret also sent a demand letter to the HOA, requesting the complete financial records for the past 3 years, all board meeting minutes, all correspondence with Premier Community Management, and the documentation of any board votes relating to the standards manual's adoption. Under Ohio law, HOA members have the right to inspect association records. Warren Pruitt had 7 days to respond. He responded in 4. His letter written personally, not through an attorney, which Margaret said was itself interesting, denied the validity of our bylaw challenge, asserted that the board had full authority over all matters described, and informed me that my outstanding violations remained in effect and that my shed had now exceeded its compliance deadline, triggering the weekly accrual penalty. He ended the letter with a line I have thought about many times since. I strongly suggest you focus your energies on bringing your property into compliance, rather than pursuing matters that are well above your pay grade. Above my pay grade. I'm a high school history teacher. I've spent 23 years teaching people how power works, how it's built, how it's used, and how it falls apart when the documents don't support it. I forwarded the letter to Margaret with 1 line of my own. Let's go. Warren Pruitt's next move was to call a special board meeting and vote with his 4 board members, the board whose legitimacy we were actively challenging to place a lien on my property for the outstanding violations. The lien was filed with the Franklin County Recorder on a Thursday afternoon. I found out about it via a certified letter the following Monday. The total claimed was $3,240, which included the original fines, the weekly accrual penalties, and a category called administrative and enforcement costs that added up to $900 and had no itemization attached. Sandra opened that letter at the kitchen table while I was still at school, and she called me between periods. I could hear in her voice the things she was trying to hold together. A lien on our house, Joel, she said. On our actual house. I know, I said. Margaret is already on it. Is she going to be enough? That was the right question. Margaret was good, but we were now in active litigation territory, and my savings weren't built for a prolonged court fight. I was honest with Sandra. I didn't know yet. What I didn't know, at that specific moment, was that I was about to get help from a direction I hadn't expected at all. 3 days after the lien was filed, a woman named Deborah Hastings called me. She'd gotten my number from Phil Garrett. She identified herself as a former member of the Ashford Glen HOA, board, one of the 2 members whose seat had been eliminated by Warren's amendment. She had been waiting, she said, for someone to do exactly what I was doing, and she had something she wanted to share. She came to my house that evening with a folder of her own. In it were the minutes from the board meeting, where the bylaw amendment had been voted on, the actual minutes, which she had kept a copy of as a board member at the time. Warren's version of those minutes, the one he'd presumably provided to Premier Community Management, and that appeared in the official record, showed 22 votes in favor of the amendment, with a note that quorum had been established. Deborah's copy showed something different. It showed that 2 homeowners had raised the question of whether the amendment threshold required a full membership majority, and that Warren had ruled the question out of order, and called the vote immediately over their objection. The objection and the ruling were not in the official minutes Warren had submitted. The official record had been altered. I looked at Deborah across my kitchen table. He changed the minutes, I said. He had control of the management company, she said. He had control of everything. I called Margaret that same night. She listened, and then she said, in the careful tone she used when something was serious, Joel, falsifying HOA meeting minutes is not just a civil matter. Depending on what we can establish about intent, it could implicate Ohio's laws on falsification of records. We need to involve the county. We filed a complaint with the Franklin County Prosecutor's Office the following week, attaching Deborah's copy of the minutes and the official version. We also filed our court action, challenging the lien and the bylaw amendment, and Margaret requested an emergency hearing. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in Franklin County Common Pleas Court. I wore my good blazer, the one I saved for parent-teacher conferences with difficult parents, and Sandra sat in the gallery behind me with Phil Garrett and Deborah Hastings. Warren Pruitt arrived with an attorney. He'd finally retained one, a real estate lawyer from a mid-size firm downtown. Warren sat at the opposite table in a dark suit, and did the thing he always did, which was project an aura of absolute certainty that he was the most legitimate person in the room. Margaret's presentation was methodical. She established the original bylaws amendment, threshold a majority of total membership, and showed the vote count from the amendment meeting. 22, against a required threshold of at least 121. She showed both versions of the meeting minutes. She documented the standards manual's basketball hoop provision, and demonstrated its absence from the actual C&Rs. She showed the 11 homeowners who had paid fines under unauthorized rules. She showed the variance denials that had never gone to a proper board vote. Warren's attorney argued that the board had acted in good faith on a reasonable interpretation of the amendment threshold. He argued that the standards manual had been effectively ratified by years of homeowner compliance. He argued that the lien was valid because the underlying violations were real. The judge, a woman in her 60s named the Honorable Patricia Wren, listened to both sides and then asked Warren's attorney a question directly. If the bylaw amendment was not validly passed, does your client dispute that the board has been improperly constituted for 2 years? 1B. Once Fanta. Warren's attorney said they disputed the premise. Judge Wren said she did not. She said the original bylaw language was not ambiguous. A majority of the total membership meant a majority of the total membership, not a majority of votes cast at a quorum meeting. The amendment had not cleared that threshold. The board restructuring was invalid. The lien was vacated. The fines assessed under unauthorized rules were ordered reversed. The board was required to restore its original 7-member structure and hold elections for the previously eliminated seats within 90 days. The HOA was ordered to pay attorney's fees, and the judge referred the minutes discrepancy to the Franklin County prosecutor for further review. Warren Pruitt sat very still at his table while all of this was read. For the first time since that Saturday morning on my porch, he did not look like the biggest personality in the room. He looked like a man who had just discovered that the building he'd been standing on wasn't as solid as he believed. The fallout came in stages, which is usually how these things work. The prosecutor's review of the minutes took about 4 months. In the end, Warren Pruitt was charged with 1 count of falsification under Ohio Revised Code 2921.13, a misdemeanor. He entered a plea agreement that included a fine, a period of community service, and his formal resignation from all positions with the Ashford Glen HOA. He did not serve jail time. I'm not going to pretend that outcome satisfied everyone, because it didn't entirely satisfy me, but he was on record, in a court of law, for altering official documents to preserve his own authority over 240 families. That record exists and doesn't go away. The HOA held new elections within the court, ordered 90 days. Phil Garrett ran and won a seat. Deborah Hastings ran and won a seat. 3 other homeowners who'd never been involved in HOA governance before put their names in, and 2 of them were elected. The new board's first official act was to formally adopt the standards manual into the governing documents through a proper amendment process, with the basketball hoop language removed entirely, and to commission an independent financial audit of the HOA accounts for the prior 3 years. That audit found something that didn't surprise me, but might surprise you. Warren Pruitt had been authorizing payments from HOA funds to a landscaping company owned by his son-in-law. Not large amounts, it totaled a little over $14,000, but it had been happening for 2 years and had never been disclosed to the board or the membership. That matter was referred separately for civil recovery. The 11 families who had paid fines under unauthorized rules received refund checks from the HOA. The amount per family ranged from a couple $100s to, in one case, over $800. It wasn't life-changing money for most of them, but every one of those families called or texted me when their checks arrived, and I'm not going to pretend that didn't mean something. My shed is still where it's always been. My basketball hoop is in my driveway. My front door is the deep navy Sandra picked, and I like it fine, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't think about painting it teal again sometimes. Here's what I want to tell you, and I want to say it plainly because I think it matters. Warren Pruitt didn't build his operation overnight. He built it slowly, over years, on the assumption that homeowners wouldn't read the documents, wouldn't ask questions, wouldn't push back when the pushback was costly and inconvenient. He was right about most people. Most people, including me for the first 7 years I lived in that neighborhood, don't read the seconders. They sign the acknowledgement at closing and file it away, and assume that whoever is running the HOA is doing it more or less legitimately. That assumption is how people like Warren Pruitt accumulate power. Not by taking it all at once, by taking it incrementally, in amounts that don't individually seem worth fighting. A bylaw amendment here. A supplemental standards manual there. A variance process that never actually goes to a vote. Each piece is small enough to feel like not quite enough to justify the trouble of pushing back. And then one day, someone knocks on your door at 7:15 on a Saturday morning and tells you he's already walked your property and found 4 violations, and you realize the whole structure has been built on the assumption that you won't look too closely at its foundation. Look closely at its foundation. Read your candors, read your bylaws. Get the original recorded documents from your county recorder, not the PDFs on the HOA website that anyone with admin access can edit. When an HOA official cites a rule, ask for the specific provision. When a fine is issued, ask for the documented authority behind it. When a decision is made without a board vote, ask for the meeting minutes that show the vote occurred. You don't have to be a lawyer to ask for documents. You're entitled to see. You don't have to be confrontational about it. You just have to be willing to ask. And if the person across from you tells you the answer is above your pay grade, that's usually the clearest sign you've ever gotten that you've asked exactly the right question. If any of this sounds familiar, if you've got a Warren Pruitt of your own, or if you've been on the receiving end of fines that didn't seem to have a real foundation, or if your HOA has ever made you feel like a tenant in your own home, I want to hear about it in the comments. Every one of those stories matters, and every one of those homeowners deserves to know they're not alone. If you've got thoughts on whose side you would have taken, or questions about how something like this could go on for so long, drop them below. I read everything. And if this story meant something to you, please give it a like and subscribe to HOA Stories Uncovered. Turn on notifications so you catch every new story we put out, because the next one is already waiting, and I promise you, Warren Pruitt was not a one-of-a-kind situation. He was just the one who knocked on the wrong door.